Okay, we are back and we left off with an internet dysfunction moment. Moved this webinar outside and I think it cut me off on collaborating with neighbors. So I'm going to do a screen share here and get back to PowerPoint. And we're going to start from the current slide. Okay. So where we were talking, where I was talking, rather, is when we're collaborating with the neighbors, it's important to consider the impact of storing more water on your land, especially if there's a downhill. Perhaps many of you have experienced that already, being on the downhill from somebody else's uphill. I know I've actually worked with landowners around development going on above them, where they're subject to, and I experienced this growing up too on our property, development above us really dramatically changed. And it wasn't a high elevation above us, but it was enough that impermeable surfaces and the way that the water flow was designed sent more water through ditches, and it ended up eroding because there's more volume at higher speed during high rainfall events than there normally was prior to the development, because now you're sending all that water that would have been stored in the landscape into a road ditch. And it ended up eating a driveway, essentially, and a culvert. And other landowners who've experienced having water come into their basement, under house foundation, not really a basement, but kind of a crawl space, essentially, that had a pump, and it actually had a curtain drain, but the curtain drain failed because with development, it was more water than that curtain drain could handle. So perhaps many of us have been on the receiving end of that. And so when you're working with your own landscape and considering storing water in your land, you want to be really clear about what happens with the excess and where will it go? Will it impact my neighbors? And so in permaculture, there's also the idea and the principle, do small incremental projects. I like working by hand more than I would want to use heavy equipment, perhaps because it gives me more control and because it's satisfying. But what it really does is it gives me the time to observe when I do certain things, what then happens. And so when you're working on retaining water in your land and you shift how water flows and how it's stored, you really do want to know what will happen if I do this. And even before you experiment, you can make some pretty educated guesses around, okay, water will be stored in the landscape this way. What's most likely to happen? If there's a downhill, there's a spillway or an overflow, what is most likely the direction the water will flow? So all of this is helpful to when you walk the land, you get a lay of the land, you understand what's going on through all four seasons. You've seen your property potentially under high water times. For those of you that might be in high flood zones too, that then have also a dry season, a really dry season, what you're looking to do is to handle the high flood times and store that in a safe way so that you're fully taking advantage of that as a water storage without necessarily being underwater for longer of the year than you want to. Kind of a tricky balance. But again, here's another visual within the PowerPoint here of an example, especially with an uphill, downhill situation. They've actually got a dam uphill of where there's a house and there's a storage shed and a water tank. So it looks like maybe there's rainwater collection off this hay storage shed going into a water tank, taking advantage of gravity here to send it into a home. And that home is creating wastewater, which goes into a gray water system and then is therefore treated before it even goes into a pond. Wastewater is also feeding an orchard. It's a little bit safer to feed orchards gray water than it would be, say, a vegetable garden. And this is a gravity feed system, so you can take advantage of gravity. An eagle just flew up. which is really nice to do. And yet, if this uphill dam breaks, that water potentially goes into the hay storage shed, goes downhill to the house. So those are the questions, the problems we'd want to work through, scenarios. What happens if? Can you divert the overflow of this dam into a different direction away from the hay storage shed and the home, ideally, and even send it into right back into the landscape, into the hillside, help hydrate that hillside without causing a slide, and so on. So this is for Southern Oregon specifically because this workshop took place in May in Southern Oregon. This could be applied to all local regions, though, using your local resources for your design process. It's really important to get as much as you can to help you, especially around soils, around property data, so you understand topographic elevation changes, contour changes. What's the watershed picture around you? So if you're a new homeowner, a new property owner, and you maybe can't access the private lands as much as you would like around you because it's privately owned land, looking at your county parcel maps, your topo maps locally can give you a sense of where really is the water likely to flow that already exists, and how might it move through your property that you can take advantage of, and also not make a mess of both on your own property, but on your neighbors' properties. If everyone did that, the world would be a better place. Not everyone does that. So oftentimes we find ourselves in situations where neighbors are unconsciously creating problems just based on the way we design houses and live in them in America and consumer society. We typically do not design houses for passive solar. We do not design houses to be in alignment with natural surroundings, using local resources, to be taking advantage of maybe even power creation, energy creation through water flow, and so on. This has been something that humans have done over millennia. We just don't think of it in a way that we probably should, because we think we have technology and industrialized advances that give us a leg up. But in some ways, because we've forgotten how to design with the landscapes, we just come in, typically like a builder will come in, build the house that they want for that building site based on the property value that it's going to get, that return economically, and not necessarily the right house, the right location, or the full consideration of seeing that home site being observing that home site, that land site for 4 seasons at least through, so that you can tell what is going on through the winter, especially, or through the rainy season, depending on where you are, and understand what's likely to happen. So a lot of times, builders might build a home, they sell it to somebody else, that person buys it, and then all of a sudden that person realizes 6 months in or a year in, this house was designed pretty poorly for this particular site, because there's this big issue that, had the builder waited, or had the homeowner built themselves and spent some time with the property, or even if they can't spend a year waiting for a house to be designed, they can at least walk the land, understand the plants that might be there, and how those plants are growing based on the moisture available, and so on. You can also look at all of your resources, property data maps, soils maps, resources like the NRCS or the USDA. They often provide farming, soils, layouts, geology, so you can understand bedrock too. These are all good resources to help you get what might be your potential for a property. So there may be a historical element to how the property was used that could give you a sense of potential. There may be a potential that, because of the geology you have, your property can actually hold and store a lot of water based on your design as a human, but that design might not naturally happen very easily on its own, just based on the existing vegetation and topography. But say you put in certain earthworks into play as a human, it will then give you a much higher potential in water storage, a higher potential in combating wildfire negative impacts, and a much higher even potential yield in food. So all sorts of good things to put into your hat when you're trying to design what works for you in terms of water features on your property. So like I've been saying, you definitely want to know local geology and topography, how that works for you. Move my face again over here. This visual is a good side view example of what might be going on underground. Sometimes it's very difficult to know. It's helpful to study all your resources so you can especially get a sense of whether or not there's clay in your soil, because that's a big one. Clay will be your impermeable layer that could make it easier to store water on your site. It could also make it easier to have a water table that has pressure potentially, and how the water moves underneath the land is definitely impacted by clay. And as an earthquake person, clay will play a role in the stability too, especially with the water table and how your foundation, your home holds up to earthquakes. But for your interests, permeability and existing vegetation, those are all things. Do you have a well on site? How well does your groundwater get recharged because of the vegetation? Those are all elements that you want to know very thoroughly in order to help put that into a high level of work for you based on the goals that you have with your property, be it to really retain as much water as possible for biodiversity, for human consumption. Say you have a well, you want to make sure that your well is replenished every year, your water bank deposits are high. You can enhance what naturally is deposited in your water bank with rainfall simply through having really good soil permeability. So some ways to investigate your geology if you don't have great maps or soil resources, rock resources to understand what's going on underground. Just dig into the soil. You can actually dig a soil profile, especially if you have a little bit of a bank. Dig into that bank, maybe going down 3 feet or so. In this photo on the left, you can get a sense of the topsoil, more organic layers, and then below that looks like more of a clay layer. And the clay changes colors. Actually, maybe that second layer could be some clays, could be some sand, and then it's a harder clay, deeper clay. It's got a little bit more blue in color. You keep going down, you're going to hit the water table. So it gives you a sense of how high, how low your water table is, how deep you're going till you find it, what the soil looks like, and therefore how will it hold water. Something that many people do, of course, when they're developing a site, they want permeability for their septic fields, their drain fields. So they're doing that percolation or perk test, which is essentially like a sump test where you're digging test holes, maybe 1 to 2 feet deep, maybe 12 inches wide. They're not necessarily huge, but whatever your width, your height, your volume, that will give you that percolation rate over time if you do the calculations correctly by pouring water into the hole, seeing how fast a certain amount of water actually percolates through the soil. And this you can do in multiple places around your property just to experiment, like how well does the land hold water? How quickly does it drain through? How long does it stay in certain sites? So this can definitely give you a leg up in understanding where you may have well-drained sites that you cannot hold and store water very easily. And so you'll need some sort of aid like a pond liner versus where you may have areas that are highly saturated, especially with rainfall, And that's because the soil level, the soil profile is really high clays, and it's telling you that yes, it can hold water here quite easily, especially if you made more of a sink and a set of berms to store that water that could be collecting water from uphill. So here's a graph of or an example of a top-down aquifer recharge model. And this is probably a little bit too steep for swales, but it looks like it could be a combination of swales, terracing, as well as a little bit of a key line, and it's for a hillside. So when you have a hillside, unless you have really permeable soils and you have sort of low spots or hummocks where the water is allowed to sit for a certain amount of time and soak in, you're always going to be potentially losing more water to gravity and that sheet flow or that surface flow than you're able to capture in the land. So in a hillside, or anytime you have slope, you definitely want to use gravity to your advantage. You're capturing and storing as much water as you can at the highest point. And then what you're doing is working with how to hold that water and slowly sink it and spread it and send it gently downhill and hydrate the whole hillside. So this landscape could have been a barren hill, dry hill, brown, yellow, hot, not really able to hold a lot of vegetation until someone dug this saddle dam. So between two high points, there's a little bit of a saddle. Those of you who are hikers and backpackers, you'll be familiar with the saddles between two mountain peaks. And they put a dam in this site, and then they're planting around that. And it looks like what they're doing is maybe sending the water through a swale in a spiral down the hillside. This could be a key line as well down the hillside. This could also just be a set of terraces down the hillside that's very gently sloped in one direction so that water is also being sent downhill. But my guess is that this is probably more of a swale system that's going between these dams, taking advantage of putting the dams in natural topography layouts that would support a dam there. They've got these silt traps. Looks like these swales are very heavily planted, so that's also going to help slow the flow, and then those trees get to soak up all that water. So ideally the trees and so on that can handle a high water, especially in the wet times, and then they'll go down to a lower water or a normal no water exposed. It's just regular soil in the drier times. But that gives your vegetation a leg up. It's simply also a matter of balancing the hydration of the soil with the vegetation that grows, and humans are managing that vegetation. In this example, perhaps it's growing firewood, perhaps it's growing fruit trees, whatever it is, fruit and nut trees. There's management going on so that you're not necessarily creating a higher fuel load, but you are sending water through your landscape as a way to keep your vegetation that you are managing hydrated. So you might not have to do any irrigation in terms of tubing, plastic added. This could be all just through capture of weather events that give you what you need, that you're slowing down and making the absorption of that water extend through time so that you can help your vegetation last longer. So for the places that are being affected or impacted by climate change in a negative way through the aridification, sometimes simply the lack of human management of the landscape, especially if like a homeowner has, say, a 5-acre parcel, they've got their property and their yard, their lawn, they're managing for the home, its property value, they're managing for the lawn. They may not be managing that 5 acres at all. Whereas 150 years ago, we would have been managing that 5 acres for food production. We would have been managing it for ensuring that we had adequate water to drink, to bathe, to grow the food. We might have been managing it for livestock. we would have been managing it and using the firewood available on the land. So the level of interaction with the landscape is so utterly different than it was because our lifestyles are not so subsistence based. And that may be a positive in some ways, but I think the more we face climate change, the negative impacts of that, we probably need to shift back into a subsistence model of how we manage the land, even if we don't need the land necessarily for our actual subsistence, because we still have a job, we still make money, we still can go to a grocery store and buy food. But if we haven't been cutting down the scrubby stuff, because that's what we also might have used to make wattle fencing for our gardens, um, or to weave baskets, you know, we haven't just been paying attention to what actually could lead to a negative impact through buildup of fuels. And or if we cut everything down for the view and we lose all that vegetation that would have soaked up a lot more water, and then we've got more sun exposure, we're drying out our land, and so on. So, observation, humans observing nature around them based on what they need to survive, it's a really important element that we need to put back into play in order to survive. And we're getting that lesson through climate change and catastrophic natural disasters. So we don't necessarily need to go back, I don't think, to growing all of our own food, creating all of our firewood. We just need to heavily interact with the landscape in a way that makes it so that we know what's going on. We know what might potentially happen if a wildfire comes through. If we're in a flood zone in a river, what's the 100-year flood going to be like? How will that impact our home? And so on. So ponds can very much be used for fire suppression. They're a fire break. This is a good picture of, got a hillside. On one side, you've got a pond. Fire might burn up to it. It cannot burn through the pond. If you put a pond on the other side, you've got a double fire break. It's great. More on ponds. If you were putting a pond in, you can definitely, based on your depth of your pond, your size, calculate how much pond liner you might use and the thickness and so on. There's examples of websites here to go to find that information, as well as finding pond plant ideas. You can be pretty native with your vegetation. You could be pretty exotic. It's all up to you. I think the world is your oyster, but the purpose and the point is also to have a water storage feature on your property that, in this case, it's functional for being a defensible technique against wildfire. This upper right example, I think it's an AI generated image, and it's kind of a fun one because it has a sense of a Mediterranean landscape. Interestingly, it looks like it's right on the sea or the ocean, but there might be these freshwater pools with stone, maybe even with some masonry and cement, where they've made it very interactive. You can walk over the bridge. There's a little bit of a waterfall. There's lovely flowers that would be probably more native. So it's pleasant, it's aesthetic, it's appealing. It's like having nature with a water feature and how nature interacts with the water feature right there, front and center. Whether you live on the water or not, you can bring this home. This lower photo, it's a real natural pond, real photo. It's not an AI generated image. That's what I mean. And it's probably a pond liner. It's got the rock landscaped edge that's helping to hold the pond liner in. It has pond plants. It probably has koi or some sort of similar fish. Maybe, maybe not. Doesn't look quite as interactive, but it's serving a purpose. It provides water for wildlife. It stores water, potentially to use to pull from if you've got wildfire locally that fire trucks could pump out of. It probably wouldn't be very much, but a much bigger pond could potentially provide a lot of water for a truck to pump out of, especially that photo. This could be the size of a pumpable pond if one of these buildings were on fire and a fire truck pulled right up. they've only got the water in their tank. Maybe they'll run out of water. Maybe this is a remote rural area. So having a pond right close to the house could provide you the extra water that you might need in order to really fight the fire and win. But this lower pond on the left is really lovely. I would want to sit there if it's a hot summer day. Maybe you can even take a little dip or sit in the pool. It looks like both these pictures look like very appealing places to be. So the potential for sure in Josephine County, I think everyone knows, very high wildfire potential. And this for our workshop at the Frog Farm Spiral Living Center. These are photos actually from the site during the Slater fire in 2020. The fire became very close to climbing over that hillside and running through the grass valley there and hitting this particular site. So the owners of this land wanted to put in a new pond, similar to this one, not quite the same shape, but basically a pumping pond. Is both a fire break and a deep pond to store as much water as possible using the water coming from a roof. They did the calculations for that volume of the roof and factored that into the size of the pond that they would need. And then they did end up buying a pond liner in order to actually ensure storage of that water. Their zone for their soils is very permeable, a lot of cobbles, a lot of sand, mixed sandy loam type, so very well draining soils would not hold water for long. And probably all of you know, in addition, fire landscaping practices that are recommended. I'm not going to go into these too deeply because that's not so much what this workshop is about, but essentially having your hardscaping, your bare land, removing your fuels, using stones, etc., immediately around the house is the point. And again, when you have water features, it's not necessarily considered hardscaping, but it would be considered a very defensible space because fire can't burn water. So it's very convenient to have it as a fire break for your home and your land. Back to that picture. So we're going to talk about the designing of water features into defensible spaces, which we've actually been talking about. But essentially, the practices that are going to work against you that you don't want to do. I'm going to get my face out of here. Without blocking the words. Anytime you're removing all the vegetation or trees or water on the land, the combinations of those practices, they're going to accelerate evaporation. They're going to accelerate soil dehydration. They're going to lower the overall water table. So that's going to work against you. However, in the event of, say, a 5-foot swath of defensible hardscaping immediately around your home versus, let's say, you've got a 5-acre, 10-acre piece of property and the rest of your landscape is very permeable, excepting maybe your driveway where you park, you've got a balance there of water saturation that will still happen, especially if you don't have a huge slope, a really steep slope, so that water isn't draining off. That your water table isn't going to necessarily be as negatively impacted as if it were, if you're clearing the entire landscape. Like in this photo, it's definitely kind of a dried out lake bed. It doesn't look like there's much life there at all. Maybe this was a homestead. They cleared everything. Feels a little bit Dust Bowl-ish when we're doing the wrong thing with what the landscape is used to or what it actually needs to thrive the most. And so let's say they removed all the vegetation that was here, all the trees, and pumped away all the groundwater. This is what we would get. This is what happens. Eventually, life is going to come back in, depending on where you are. You may be in more lush zones, but we can really dehydrate out landscapes pretty intensively. Anytime you're shunting the surface water off your property, you're losing that hydration impact and ability. Anytime you have a curtain drain around the entire property rim, or at least like say 50% of it or more, where if you've got a hillside, you put a curtain drain behind and above your house to make sure that the water isn't draining into your home, underneath it, into the foundation or basement, which is a good thing. You want that. But if your curtain drain fully directs water off your property and onto the neighbors, you've fully lost that ability for everything that might be above you or where that hillside sends water, where the curtain drain is catching that water. You've lost that ability to contain that water unless you redirect your curtain drain so it comes back. Let's say it comes back around from a U shape, the back of your house, it comes all the way back around to the front. So that's something to ask if you don't know, like from your, say your previous homeowner or a builder, if you don't know if you have a curtain drain, and you may know if you don't anyway, if you've had like flooding issues because you've got a high water table and you've got a foundation that continues to flood. But you definitely want to be able to work with that, and you may have to work with that on a more subsurface level in order to shift how water moves through the landscape so you don't flood your house, but you don't lose the ability to store water in your landscape around your home at the same time. Of course, when you draw down more water than you replenish, that also works against you in land hydration. And when we send valuable rainwater into storm drains and directly into the sea instead of back into the land, we end up dehydrating the land as well. All the times we create impermeable surfaces or we hardscape land, even just through compaction, driving on dirt roads, let alone pavement. Anytime we have surface areas in roofs, and we don't end up catching that water and sending it back into the landscapes. If you have gutters that drain underground and that go into your septic field, you're concentrating all that, or a drain field, all that roof water into that drain field, where you may be able to take out a section of the pipe going from your gutters to your drain field and redirect that water into the landscape in a different way. So it's not maybe a swamp above your drain field, and it actually waters your roof water, waters a different section of your property. Okay, practices that work for you in land hydration, definitely observing your landscape, using gravity to help you. You want to increase always the permeability and the sponge absorption factor of your soils, trying to turn your top soil layer into the biggest sponge you possibly can to hold as much water. Having a thoughtful placement of your tree canopy, because that provides shade, especially if you've got deciduous trees, where you can shade out summer sun and keep a house cooler. Passive solar kind of principles, keep your house cooler in the summer and also limit the evaporation from groundwater, from say vegetation underneath that shady area, but you'll lose the leaves in the winter, so you get the summer sun and you get that summer heat. You want to design with your topography. So when I talked about on contour, that's what you're doing. You're designing with your topography in a way that's beneficial to you and your goals, be it that you want to store more water in the landscape. You know how to do that based on what kind of topography you have. If you're balancing your water use, the drawdown and the replenishment, that's your banking model. That's very beneficial. If you're replenishing or making more deposits than you need, that's definitely beneficial and helpful. That will help create ponds, natural high water areas in your property. But again, that creates a situation, or can lead to the situation, where you have too much water, you create an overflow or spillways, and then where will that go? You want to make sure you're not causing problems downstream or downhill when you have more water than you actually need. But the more water you actually need than you actually need creates that situation where you can share water with the neighbors. So having that mindset is always a good thing in today's world, and use nature to help you do less work, Nature wants to do this stuff for you too. She knows how to do it. She knows how to send in plants with deep tap roots into compacted soil areas as a way to help break up the soil, to channel more water down through the soil, to get it back into the landscape, to hydrate that land. So these things are always happening in nature anyway. As humans, we can accelerate the time frame, which is why I like permaculture for restoration work in particular. If you go in and mimic what certain plants actually do, pioneer species and so on, then you can actually make things happen more quickly and give nature a leg up and compress your time frame so you get more work done faster, but hopefully don't do that work necessarily as the human. Rainwater collection is a really good thing to do too if you can. I know that there are different laws in different states, and I'm going to leave that up to everybody to do their own research. I'm of the mindset that sometimes the laws don't always reflect the best way to support the natural world and to provide as many resources as those laws can for humans. So go through your decision-making process perhaps with a different mindset than the building industry would like for you to go through. So rainwater, it may or may not be a good thing in your community to collect. I wouldn't worry about it too much though. It's just good to be aware of what's happening. And there can be a large volume that you create in terms of storage because a roof surface area can actually hold a lot of or collect a lot of rain. And so sending it into a tank that has adequate storage, definitely want to do those calculations. You want to know, again, what happens if you overflow? What will you do then? This example is a good one. They're actually showing that they've got a gravity feed, but uphill based on the water tank being below the roof line and the pressure in terms of filling for how the water would move through the pipe. And then they're taking advantage of that tank being on the uphill to send it back through slowly because there's a swale that will slow the water down and the vegetation that will soak the water up and feed life. So this is a good model. Definitely look at the models that will work best for you, and you can choose tanks based on lifespan, aesthetics, and so on. Here's some examples that we have put into play. This is one site in particular, really took place in terms of design and creation because it was by hand slowly over about a year and a half time frame, working with the landowner and based on their available resources, the collection of resources, their goals, and their financial resources to put toward that. But the pictures on the left show this was a dry, rocky outcropping, southern exposure, pretty hot, not able to support a lot of life except one native plant that's borderline invasive. And so we flagged it and put in roughly some contour lines for the path and an extra little loop path there. And then basically turned the upper bed and the lower bed into terraces. So use the rocks to create a stable, just rocks around a farm that had been churned up over the years with tractors over like 100-year plus process. Nothing fancy, just quick and easy with people power to hold, make it so that the soil in the terraces is deeper. It can hold more rich organic soil to make this hillside much more moist, much more fertile, and therefore support more life. So the photo on the right shows you what happened once we created this terrace model and when it was planted. It still needs to be watered, but excuse me, that moisture is held for longer. And all this life that couldn't grow there before can now grow there. And it's productive in terms of flowers and food, and the pollinators love it. So pretty easy example, not a ton of time, but definitely stretched out based on the landowner's resources for creation. And in terms of how quickly the foliage grew in, I would say from the pictures on the left to the photo on the right was really about a 1.5 year process, and it's very lush. Still looks beautiful. Different plants have been planted in there, but still nepeta, poppies, roses, golden chain trees. There's other plants in there, sea kale, and I can't remember, nigella, some other flowers. So some natives, some non-natives, all plants that can handle pretty warm sun in southern exposure, but that still need some well-drained soil and some moisture to survive. Here's another example of a project that we're working on. Maybe a little bit tricky to tell, but this is in process. This is in Southern Oregon. This will be a slow project based on the time this property owner has and resources that they have to put toward the project. But here you can see it's an old barn, sort of carport, probably a building that's 60 or 70 years old. And the vegetation, this is pre-trimming up this vegetation for firewise practices, lots of garden debris and so on. There's a driveway that feeds into a ditch here that then feeds under, if this is a blue spruce type tree, into a dugout pond that fills in the winter, but it has no pond liner and it doesn't have enough clay. So the water stays high till March or April, and then it actually sinks back into the soil. But this ditch has filled in over time. That would be in this photo on the right here, leading up to the blue spruce and the wheelbarrow. And so this ditch needed to be redug, which has begun to happen. Trees were trimmed up a little bit. A tractor was driven in here. That will be ditched out later, but a bridge was installed and that ditch will connect into, you can barely see the pond under here. And then eventually this homeowner will put a pond liner in and probably plant some shade trees, some deciduous shade trees on the back side of the pond to shade the summer sun, try to not create algae growth situations and warm up the waters of the pond too much. Oh, here's a closer view. You can see this ditch leading into the pond. It's actually probably 4.5, 5 feet deep or so. So it wouldn't necessarily warm up incredibly fast like a shallower pond would and create potential algae situations. But here's a human for scale, and that's actually in the dugout pond. It definitely would, it would still be warmer than it probably is healthy. And so any shade trees we can add over here on the back side. And this blue spruce seems very much like it's happy there, happy to thrive if that's what it is. That's the last slide. So work in progress, but it'll be a really fun project when it gets landscaped with rocks on the edge and completed in its landscaping. I don't know if this homeowner will do fish in the pond. I think just having a water storage area and having that be a fire break for any of the buildings coming from that direction is helpful. And especially there's a lot of water that flows above this pond and into that ditch that's falling in the winter rain onto a compacted driveway. So to get it off that driveway and into the ditch, the swale that then leads into pond storage is great. And then it slows the flow because it will continue to flow down, slightly downhill. It mostly looks level, but there is just enough of an incline. The water will find the way to move through gravity, and it flows into the neighbors and floods their cow pasture for 3 to 5 months during the winter. So the more that this property can hold that water for longer, the better for everybody. So that is the last slide. I would take questions at this point, and in the workshop, what we typically do is encourage landowners to ask questions about their particular problems, work those out together. So if you want to ever come to a webinar workshop live, let me know, send me an email, and we'll see what we can do. It's nice. This one in particular was tailored for Southern Oregon. It's nice to tailor them for the places where we are doing the workshop, just because, we're talking about local issues, but the general principles all apply. And in particular, of course, this is for wildfire mitigation, and even, simple, small, 5 foot wide by 2 feet deep ponds that are hand dug. You can buy like a 40 mil or 50 mil thicker pond liner that will last you for a long time. Gather some landscaping rocks. There's a little bit of resources financially that you might have to put into that. Something as simple as that can actually make a positive impact in terms of being a fire break based on where it's placed. And of course, there's an aesthetic appeal to it. It creates beauty. It creates a place that people or humans want to be, especially kids. They like to interact with things in a pond. I know I still do, even though I'm an adult. I like to go just hang out by ponds if it's not too mosquito-y, where you can listen to the frogs and you can see the weird bugs that are in there and play with the duckweed and enjoy looking at lily pads and so on, thinking about what it would be like to be a frog. Those are places that humans are drawn to. We gravitate toward nature. So if you started a series of those around your house, you're biting off little projects one at a time. And pretty soon you might have a whole line of connected ponds. You've got a fire break. Your home is protected. Maybe you've got a friend with a bulldozer. You can dig a bigger pond. You've actually got a pond then that you can pull water from. There's all sorts of possibilities. But again, really taking your time, get some paper, get some colored pencils, a bunch of different Sharpies, even different colors, and start to map out your property and what you might be able to do with it, and list out what your problems are. List out how you can turn those problems into a positive based on what you might need to do and what you can do as a human, even with just a shovel and an hour. What difference could you do with that shovel and an hour based on how the rain falls in the winter and based on how dry the land is over here, and because you have gravity. So playing with your land, playing with that piece of paper as you design, depending on the time of year it is, you'll see, you might be worried in summer as it gets dry, and you'll see, how lush your property might get again in the winter as it rains. But the point is to make it so we're kind of watery all year round, especially for those of you in drier regions. Okay, thank you so much. We're going to end it there. Have a great day. Talk to you later. Bye. And one last thing, I'm Sarah Hansen with On Sacred Ground Land Trust. We're at www.onsacredgroundlandtrust.org. We're based up in northwestern Washington, but we are trying to do work in multiple regions of the country, as well as we are willing to work around the world when we're connected in mission and in permaculture goals. So feel free to reach out, look us up on the websites and our projects. You can find information there for how to send us an email and ask questions. Okay, thank you so much. Bye.